Half the price of a steer, folks. The voice boomed across the market square, coarse and brittle as old leather. It belonged to her father, and the steer he was selling was her. She can cook, sew, and keep quiet. Anyone with enough coin can take her home tonight. Mabel's voice was a prisoner in her own throat. She wanted to scream, to run, but she only trembled as her father shoved her forward, making her stumble into the dusty center of the square. Men laughed. Women whispered behind their hands. Children watched wide-eyed from behind their mothers' apron skirts. The spring wind carried the stench of manure and smoke, but nothing stung more than the shame blooming hot in Mabel's chest. Her cheeks burned, not just from the sun, but from the memory of her wedding dress being torn from her, of being dragged from her husband's house like a thief. For 2 years she had prayed, swallowing every bitter herb the midwife offered, hoping for a child that never came. Then just like that, her husband took another wife, a younger girl, loud and cunning, who declared she'd bear 5 sons if the Lord allowed. Mabel wasn't even allowed to stay until sunset. She was barren, a broken vessel, useless. Anyone, her father barked again, his voice cracking with desperation. She's 22, still has her teeth, just faulty inside. A long, ugly silence stretched over the crowd. Then it parted. Bootsteps, heavy, slow, purposeful. A man stepped forward. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his shirt stained with sap and sawdust. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed most of his face, but his jaw was strong, his hands rough from work. And his eyes, when he finally looked up, were not cruel. They were just tired. He didn't speak. He reached into the folds of his coat, pulled out a worn leather pouch, and let the coins clink onto the table. No bartering, no questions, just enough to silence the jeers. Mabel's father raised an eyebrow. "You sure there's no refund on this one?" The man looked at Mabel one long, assessing moment. Then he turned back to her father. His voice was low, like the rumble of distant thunder. "She won't be judged in my house." That was all he said. He turned and walked away, not even glancing back to see if she followed. The crowd was already losing interest. Her father gave her a final dismissive shove. "Go on then, you're his now." She picked up her satchel containing little more than old shoes and a locket with her mother's face inside, and followed the silent man into the dust. Was this mercy or just a different kind of prison? His name, she would learn, was Silas, and he had a mule-drawn cart tied outside the blacksmith's. He didn't help her up. He just waited. When she finally scrambled in, he handed her a canteen. "Long ride." She drank. The water tasted of tin and silence. They traveled for hours, the prairie stretching on either side, a vast canvas of dry grass and leaning fences, under a sky that went on forever. She glanced at him more than once. His face was weathered, but he wasn't old. Maybe 30. There was no wedding ring on his hand, just calluses and a fresh splinter in his thumb. "Why," she finally whispered the word, barely a breath. "Why did you take me?" He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the horizon. 4 kids, he said flatly. "No mother, no time to find one the polite way." Mabel's breath caught. "So I'm a governess." For the first time he turned his head, his tired eyes meeting hers. "No," he said. "You're just someone who isn't cruel. Around here, that's enough." They arrived at a cabin nestled in a grove of pine and cottonwood. The front porch sagged. A wagon wheel leaned against a barn that looked one strong wind away from giving up. As they pulled in, 4 small faces peeked from behind a window curtain before scattering like startled fawns. 3 boys, 1 girl, all with wary, suspicious eyes. "This is Miss Mabel," Silas told them as they stood huddled in the doorway. "She'll be staying." The oldest boy, Josiah, who looked to be about 8, narrowed his eyes. His gaze was a challenge, a wall she would have to climb. The youngest, a toddler named Benji, toddled over and wrapped his arms around Silas's leg, hiding his face. Silas picked him up with one arm and gestured to the house with the other. "Room's upstairs," he said to Mabel. "Warm water in the bucket." She climbed the creaking stairs, her legs shaking. The room was small, but the bed was neatly made. A single window overlooked the woods. She sat on the edge of the mattress and finally let herself weep, but made no sound. She had not chosen this life. But as she sat there, she realized something. For the first time in months, no one was asking her why she was broken. and no one was demanding she be anything else. The first weeks were a clumsy dance of survival. The cabin smelled of pine resin, old bread, and children's socks. The four little ones were not angels. They were wild things, quick to scatter and slow to trust. Josiah watched her every move, his silence a constant judgment. Eli, the second boy, was always hungry and loud about it. The girl Hannah clung to her father's pant leg like a burr. Only little Benji followed Mabel's shadow as if it were safer than his own. Mabel started slowly. She burned the first pot of beans. The bread didn't rise. She stitched socks with fingers that had grown clumsy and stiff. One afternoon, while trying to lift a heavy pot of stew, she slipped. It crashed to the floor, a brown lumpy sea spreading across the wooden planks. The children froze. Mabel stared at the mess, her body tensing, waiting for the shout or the slap that was sure to follow. But Silas only walked over, squatted down, and picked up the dented pot. He looked at her, then at the stew, and said, "It's only stew." That was all. No anger, no disappointment. Just a simple statement of fact. That night she sat on the porch and failed once again not to cry. And then the storm came. It wasn't just a storm of wind and rain. It was a storm of fever that descended upon the house and settled in the small body of Hannah. The little girl burned with a heat that scared even Silas. He, a man who could fell a pine tree with an axe, stood helplessly over his daughter, his big hands useless. Mabel moved. She didn't think. She acted. She boiled willow bark, a remedy her grandmother had taught her. She crushed mint leaves and bathed Hannah's forehead in cool cloths, murmuring softly through the long dark night. Her hands, once clumsy, were now sure and steady. She did not sleep. When dawn broke pale and gray, the storm outside was over. And inside, the fever had broken too. Hannah opened her eyes and mumbled something about pancakes. Silas stood in the doorway, arms folded, his shoulders slumped with relief. He looked at Mabel, who was bleary-eyed and too tired to smile, as if she had performed some kind of miracle. He said nothing. But that morning when Mabel came downstairs, a steaming mug of tea sat waiting for her on the table. Beside it was a small piece of wood with two words unevenly carved into it. "Thank you." No name, no signature. But Mabel felt her throat tighten. The tea was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out. She had been tossed away like broken furniture, sold like livestock, measured only by a womb that refused to bloom. But here in this lopsided cabin, someone had seen her hands, her effort, her care. Not her failure. Later that afternoon, Benji toddled up to her, lifted his little arms, and said one word clear as sunrise. "Mabel." And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Mabel smiled back. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Spring slowly softened the land, and with it something softened in Mabel. She taught the children letters using charcoal on old planks. She showed Hannah how to tie a ribbon and stitch matching scarves from old feed sacks. They took to calling her Miss May, and she never corrected them. But fear still lived under her ribs, a bruise that wouldn't heal. One afternoon, Silas asked her to ride into town with him. At the general store, the air was thick with gossip, and then a voice sharp and cruel cut through the clatter. "Well, if it ain't the Barren ghost herself." Mabel turned. Her former mother-in-law stood there, fanning herself with a newspaper. Beside her was the new wife, smug and young, her hand placed performatively on her still flat belly. "That's her," the young woman asked loud enough for half the store to hear. "Yes," the older woman sneered. "Pretty but cursed. Useless as a cracked jar." Mabel's hands balled into fists. Her throat was thick with everything she refused to give them, her tears, her pain, her shame. She turned to walk away. Then a hand touched her shoulder. It was Silas. He had stepped out from the shade of the store dirt, still on his boots, his eyes like storm clouds. He looked at the two women, his gaze flat and hard. Then he turned to Mabel, and his voice, though low, carried through the sudden quiet. "This woman," he said, "is the only one who can get my daughter to sleep through the night. The only one who taught my son not to be afraid of the dark. The only one who makes my house feel like it has a roof." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "She is not useless. She is everything." He didn't wait for a response. He simply took Mabel's arm and led her away. No more words were wasted. On the ride home, as the sun bled, orange and purple across the sky, Mabel felt a shift inside her. She wasn't just a helper anymore. She had been defended. She had been claimed. That night when the children were asleep, she sat by the fire and watched Silas whittling a small wooden bird. He didn't speak, but he didn't have to. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, full of respect, full of a quiet growing warmth. Weeks turned into months. Whispers from the town eventually reached their remote cabin. The new wife, so proud and fertile, had been caught in a lie. There was no baby. There never had been. Desperate, she had faked the pregnancy only to be discovered and cast out by Mabel's ex-husband. One day Mabel was in town alone when he appeared. He looked older, worn down, his hat crushed in his hands. "Mabel," he said, his voice broken. His voice. "I was wrong. I see that now. You were the only one who ever truly—" She held up a hand, stopping him. Her voice was steady, clear as a bell. "I remember the day you let your mother spit on my name. I remember the day you threw me out. You didn't mourn a wife. You mourned a faulty investment." She stepped closer. "I have 4 children who argue over who gets to sit next to me at supper. I have a man who has never once asked what I cannot give, only what he can." She looked him dead in the eye. "My house is full, sir, and I would rather sweep ashes for Silas for the rest of my days than sit on a silk cushion in yours." She turned and walked away, leaving him speechless in the dust. Across the street, Silas stood holding a sack of flour. He had seen it all, and on his face was not pride but something deeper, gratitude, and a look that made Mabel's heart beat a little faster, a look that said she was chosen, not once at a market, but every single day. But peace on the frontier is a fragile thing. One evening, as Mabel went to the well, a man stumbled out from the shadows, Jed, a trapper from down the ridge, half drunk and mean-spirited. "Well, look here," he slurred. "The pretty little mule Silas dragged home. Heard you were Barren, but you're raising his kids just fine." He moved fast, his hand closing around her wrist, his grip hard and bruising. "Come on now, you owe us all a little smile." Before she could scream, a shadow exploded from the barn. It was Silas. There was no warning, no shout, just one clean, fast punch that sent Jed crumpling to the dirt. Silas stood over him, chest heaving, his knuckles bleeding. He didn't even look at the groaning man. He turned to Mabel, his eyes dark with a protective fire she had never seen. "You all right?" he asked, his voice a low growl. She could only nod, her heart pounding. Back inside, in the quiet of the lamplight, she gently washed the blood from his hand. The room was thick with unspoken things. "You didn't have to," she said softly. Silas looked up at her, his gaze intense. "I don't like fighting," he said, "but I like seeing someone hurt you a whole lot less." Her breath hitched. I was scared," she admitted, "but not of him. I was scared because no one has ever stood up for me like that before." He said nothing, just watched her as she bandaged his hand. His calloused fingers gently brushed against hers. When she finished, he didn't pull away. He simply took her hand, the one Jed had grabbed, and held it in his own. Outside, the stars were sharp and bright. Inside, a man who never raised his voice had finally raised his hand for her. And she, a woman told her whole life that she was not enough, finally felt like she was everything. It wasn't love spoken in fancy words. It was love proven in bruised knuckles and a shared quiet breath in a fire-warmed room. The day it all changed started with a scream. It was morning, and Mabel was kneading dough when the cry, sharp and full of pain, ripped through the air. It was Josiah. She ran, flour dusting her bare feet, her heart leaping into her throat. He was crumpled by the woodpile, his leg twisted at a horrifying angle, the axe lying ominously nearby. Silas was already there, his face a mask of iron control, as he scooped the boy up. "Boil water," he commanded, his voice urgent but calm. "Get the clean cloths." Mabel flew into action. On the kitchen table, the boy's wound was a terrifying gash. As she pressed a cloth to it, her hands shaking, Josiah cried out. "I know, baby, I know," she whispered, her own tears dripping onto his pale cheek. "Just hold on." She worked, cleaning and binding her fear, a living thing in her chest. Then a small voice cut through the haze of pain. "Don't cry, Mama?" Mabel froze. The word hung in the air. "Mama." Josiah looked at her, his lips trembling, but his eyes were clear. "You sing soft," he whispered, "like my real mama used to." The dam inside her broke. She cupped his cheek, the tears falling freely now, not of sorrow but of a profound, shattering joy. That night, after Josiah was settled, the other children gathered around her. Hannah, the little girl she'd saved from fever, leaned against her. Papa said you're staying, she said seriously. Does that mean you're our mama now? Mabel couldn't speak. She just looked at their hopeful faces and nodded. And that was enough. Later, after the house had gone still, Silas found her on the porch, staring up at the stars. He stood beside her for a long time before speaking. I ain't ever been a good talker, he began, his voice rough with emotion. When I put my money down at that market, I figured I was giving you a way out. I never figured I had a right to keep you. He took a deep breath. If you want to leave Mabel, find a new life. I won't stop you. I won't hold you to what started as a sale. She turned, her heart thudding. He was offering her freedom, true freedom. I used to think love was being chosen at first sight, she said softly. But I've learned something better. It's being chosen again every day after people see who you really are. She stepped toward him and took his calloused hand in hers. If you're not sending me away, Silas, she said, her voice full of a strength she never knew she had, then I'm not going. I may not have given birth to these children, but they gave birth to me. And you, she looked up at him, you let me grow. He looked at her, then not with pity but with awe, as if she were the one who had rescued him. He pulled her into his arms, not as a man claiming a prize, but as a man holding a miracle. Mabel, he whispered into her hair, stay. Please, just stay. And in that quiet, fire-warmed cabin, the woman once sold for less than a cow was reborn. Her new name was not given by law or by marriage, but whispered in a child's fever, earned in a defender's bruised knuckles, and sealed in a promise under the stars. It was a name built not on blood, but on belonging. Years passed. The children grew, their laughter filling the small cabin. Mabel's garden, once a desperate patch of dirt, bloomed wild and stubborn behind the house. It was a testament to her spirit, a splash of life against the harsh landscape. One day, men in clean boots came with maps promising a railroad and good money for their land. Silas listened, then looked past them to the garden, to the house, to Mabel standing beside him. He saw everything that mattered. This land is not for sale, he said simply. Later, he hammered a sign at the edge of their property. It read, someone was allowed to stay here. That is enough. The children eventually married and brought home grandchildren. The house filled with new noise, new life. One afternoon, a grandson looked at the carving Silas had made over the garden gate. Grandpa, what does it say? Silas smiled, his eyes soft. It said, she did not bear my blood, but she gave birth to the rest of my life. When Mabel passed, they buried her at the foot of the garden under a whispering oak tree. On the stone, Silas etched one line. Here grew everything she was never given and all that she gave anyway. He sat by that grave every morning until one day he did not come out. They buried him beside her. In the garden, their legacy of defiant love never stopped growing. Long after the railroad had to curve around their hill, travelers would pass the old fence and see the sign faded by sun and time. Not for sale, because some places and some hearts remember those who refuse to leave. They remember the ones who chose to love when no one else would, and prove that even the most barren ground can bloom. If this story of Mabel and Silas touched something quiet and true inside your heart, then you're in the right place. Here at the Story Nook, we believe that the most powerful stories aren't always about grand adventures, but about the grit, sacrifice, and defiant hope found in the human heart. Mabel's story reminds us that our worth is not defined by what we cannot do, but by the love we choose to give. If you want more tales of hard-earned hope, found families, and the kind of love that rises from the dust and stays through the drought, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the Story Nook, and ring that notification bell. Because here we know that the best stories are the ones that plant a seed in your soul and stay with you long after they're over. Thanks for listening.